And I think, I'm not sure what order you two would like to go in, but we'll let you decide that. And before we start, before you formally introduce yourselves, why don't we just let you know who we are? If you can, I think you can probably see us all. I'm here, David Durfee. I'm the chair of the committee. I am from Shaftesbury, down in Bennington County, represent Shaftesbury and Glastonbury and Sunderland. And we'll just go around the room here and introduce ourselves.
Sure. Hi, all. Heather Supernaut, Vice Chair. I represent Windsor 4, which is Barnard, Pomfret, and Bridgewater.
Hi, my name is Esme. I represent Windsor 6 in Hartford, Vermont.
Hi, John O'Brien. I represent Windsor Orange 1, which is Royalton, and my hometown of Pembroke.
Mike Rice, represent the Bennington Rutland District, towns of Danby, Dorset, Landgrove, Mount Tabor, and Peru.
I'm David Templeman, Orleans 3. That's Brownington, Orleans, Barton, and Westmore. Thank you.
Henry Pearl, I represent Danville, Peacham, and Cabot.
Jed Lipsky represents Stowe.
Rodney Graham, represent Williamstown and Chelsea.
So welcome, and we'll let you just jump right in.
Okay. Heather, you want me to go?
Either way is fine, Joshua. I'm sorry, I'm in Colorado today, so
Oh, you're probably a little
guess spot. So.
little jet lag too. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I'm glad to go. And so I did kind of put together just a handful of slides that I would go ahead and use. I'll pull those up here in a moment. So just to introduce myself again, Joshua Faulkner. I'm a research assistant professor here at UVM and with Extension, and also direct the soil testing lab, which serves the farmers and gardeners, homeowners of the state. We make recommendations on over 6,000 soil tests every year. And we also do quite a bit of work for UVM researchers or others in the state of Vermont who are studying soil and water quality issues. We are a fee-for-service lab, and we have a pretty good rate for the work we do. So I'm really proud of the lab. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. I just want to, like Laura said, I'm Extension. I want to just share some slides to frame some of the issues that drive my work, and then talk about just a snippet of just a handful of projects that are actively going on right now, and then hopefully have plenty of time for some questions, and to transition to Heather. So let me make sure I can share here. All right, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So first and foremost, I would say climate change is driving a lot of the work that I do. You're all Vermonters, so you know the effects of climate change on our state. One of the key ones that I think my program is most concerned with is changes in precipitation, both the fact that we're getting wetter. In some cases, you'll see at the top left-hand corner of my screen, up in the Northeast Kingdom, up to a 9-inch increase in average annual precipitation over 30 years. And it's, in addition to getting wetter, those patterns of precipitation are changing, and that's resulting in really heavy downpours that are quite a challenge for farms to manage, and have real impacts on soils. And that's me standing in a cornfield. That's sweet corn in Williston, not long after I arrived at UVM in 2013, from one single thunderstorm resulted in that level of erosion from that field. And there's lots of data that indicates that, as we see this increasing rainfall, we'll see a disproportionate increase in soil erosion. And so that's top of mind for me and the work we're doing. And then the other thing that we're concerned with is, of course, it's not just the impacts on the farm from climate change, it's the impacts downstream due to climate change. And it's, as we see that soil erode from farms, that soil has to go somewhere, right? And it takes nutrients with it. And they end up in our water bodies, the eastern half of the state. They end up in the Long Island Sound. Here's an image of the Connecticut River just after Tropical Storm Irene, just belching out all this sediment into the Sound. All that soil is not from agriculture, of course, but a lot of it is. And then on the west half of the state, we see similar things happening in the Champlain Basin. And then it's these changes from the climate, their impacts on agriculture, but then also how farmers are responding to those impacts. And there's a lot of questions that we're tackling around those adaptation measures. A big one right now is subsurface drainage, is drainage tile. In my mind, this is probably the number one way that people growing field crops are responding to climate change and trying to adapt. It is a really complicated issue because in some ways it can reduce surface erosion, and in other ways it can lead to transport of nutrients and sediment to some degree through a new pathway out of the field. And so, we find instances of things like this happening, and this is driving a lot of the research to understand, well, how much phosphorus, how much sediment is actually being lost through tile drainage. And then more importantly, how can we manage for that? How can farms change the way they're managing their nutrients or their soil to reduce this loss? Okay, so that kind of frames the work we're doing. And then as far as the nuts and bolts of the research and what fills my day, I'm just going to click through several projects here. I'll start with some watershed scale research that we're doing. Vermont was, I think, extremely fortunate to be included in a national scale project in early 2020 called the Conservation Effects Assessment Project. And this is funded by NRCS, and there's watersheds all over the country. And Vermont, the Champlain Basin is now host to the first of these study watersheds in over 15 years in the Northeast. So we're really excited about that. And it's, as the name implies, the goal here is to really quantify the effect and benefit of all the conservation practices that farmers are doing at a watershed scale. It seems like a really simple question, and that we should know the answer to that as much as we're investing in conservation practices. But there's lots of room to sharpen the pencil on those calculations, on those measurements and calculations. And so that's what this project is doing. And it's, measuring water quality during base flow periods as well as storm events. And the goal here is to have this, and the commitment from NRCS is a 10-year funding period or longer. So that's really exciting for us. The watersheds that we're studying for this particular project are both in Addison County. Our treatment watershed are to the East Branch and West Branch of the Dead Creek. Those are about a little over 15,000 acres. And for those of you who are familiar with that part of the basin, very heavy clay soils. And this watershed is dominated by agriculture. Over 75% of the land area is in agricultural usage. And then the other watershed we're studying is the Little Otter Creek, just north and east of there. Spans across Moncton, New Haven, and Bristol. That's a little bit larger watershed. Again, heavy clay soils with some lighter soils up in the, as you get toward the watershed boundary, and that's about 50% agriculture. And so we do have data on these from now almost 2.5 years of monitoring, and look forward to continuing to do that and develop results based upon those data. Something else we're doing in those watersheds is also monitoring soil health. So soil health is also driving a lot of our work, a lot of questions around soil health, a lot of practices that are geared towards improving soil health. What we want to do in these watersheds, because we're measuring water quality, we want to correlate the water quality changes with any changes in soil health. And so this is one of the first studies of its kind. And so we're monitoring 70 fields across those watersheds for soil health, as well as measuring soil carbon with a subset of those. And then, of course, providing these data back to farmers so that it benefits them as well as us in our research work. And the data set from this work right here is part of a fact sheet that Heather shared just before we got started. So you can actually see some of those data within that work that she has. And then stepping down from the watershed, we're also doing I would say even more work at the field scale. So literally measuring runoff, measuring soil health right at the edge of the field and within the field. These are just photos of a handful of our monitoring stations. We have 19 or 20 monitoring stations out there right now, all within the Champlain Basin. And it covers surface runoff, ditch runoff, runoff from tile drains. We're just trying to capture anywhere the water is leaving a field. We're trying to measure how much water, and we're trying to sample that water for water quality, and then ultimately make a connection between that and what conservation practices, how the field is being managed. And so we've here's just a snapshot of some of the results from that work. There's a lot of concern around tile drainage and the phosphorus that's transported through that. This is a full year's worth of continuous monitoring at one field for total phosphorus. And just to kind of put it in context, farmers apply 60 to 80, maybe sometimes even a little more phosphorus, pounds per acre of phosphorus on their fields. And we're measuring right around 1 to 1.4 pounds per acre of phosphorus that leaves that field. So a very small fraction of the phosphorus actually leaves the field in tile drainage. But we do see that the vast majority of the phosphorus that leaves the field in the tile drainage does leave during storm events. It's not during that low base flow kind of drainage of the root zone that you see in the spring and sometimes in the fall. It is really driven by these storm events, and that's a function of the clay soils within the Champlain Basin and how they form cracks, and water tends to flow down through those cracks and sometimes right into tile drains. And so stepping from in the field to beyond the field edge, we're also doing work on phosphorus filters. Excuse me. This is just a schematic of a filter that we've just constructed. We just constructed a couple of these in Addison County, and these are devices that are designed to, although we can manage the nutrients as best we can in the field, and in many cases we still have some leakage of phosphorus out of the field, and so these are designed to clean up that phosphorus that might still be leaving the field. They have different types of materials in them. We use a zero valent iron to filter, and it actually just grabs the soluble phosphorus in the drainage water as it's leaving the field. And here's a picture of a couple of those that we built this past year. One on the left is tied into a tile drainage system there that's about 6 feet underground, and the one on the right is in a ditch. This is a ditch filter system, all using the same type of media. And so we have some preliminary data on these from this past fall, and hope to collect more over the next year and a half. And then the last thing that we're interested in is not only adaptation to climate change, but also how can agriculture potentially be a solution to climate change? To what degree can we mitigate climate change through reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from soils, and also sequestration of carbon in soils? And so we have a new project that we're about a year into, and the fund starts this spring. But this is part of another national project called the U.S. Dairy Soil and Water Regeneration Project. And in this project, we're measuring greenhouse gas emissions from the soils, soil health, soil carbon down to a 1 meter depth and water quality. And so this is one of the first studies of its kind where all of those components are being captured within a single field. And this is set up so that we're studying kind of business as usual practices by a farm versus a suite of what we call advanced soil health management practices. So things like no-till and cover crops and manure injection. And so we're really excited about this in the years to come and really trying to understand if a farm can become net zero. So can they sequester as much carbon in their soil during feed production as they emit from those feed production activities? Okay, and that's my last slide. I'm going to stop sharing right now, and I don't know what we want to do. If you want me to turn it to Heather, or we want to do questions now.
Let's see if there's any questions on your presentation. Representative Templeman.
Actually, I'll look at the camera. Hi, Josh. I'm David Templeman. I'm curious about your objective to reach net zero, and I think you specified this was for the raising of agricultural feed crops. Aren't there agricultural practices that can do better than net zero, that could actually sequester carbon and offset other emissions in other sectors of our economy by not growing feed crops at all and just depending on perennial grasses to feed our dairy cows and our meat animals?
That may very well be possible. This is, because of the way this study was designed, we were just focusing on corn silage systems, but a transition to a perennial system may very well indeed increase carbon. There's, beyond a net zero level. One of the things that I think we're learning about agriculture and kind of soil carbon is that there's been some really great results from other parts of the country, but we don't have quite as much data as we need here in the Northeast, especially our soil types and our climate, to understand to what degree we can do that in Vermont. So this will help chip away at that question. But agriculture is a big world, and so this one won't necessarily be able to answer that one about perennial crops.
Representative O'Brien.
Josh, I'm just wondering, as small as Vermont is, we have all these different soil types or regions, right? So you're talking a lot about clay and Addison. Aspirationally, do we want to do something different to the clays and Addison so that they'll be more resilient with these extreme weather events, or even what that soil looks like to potentially grow, the best product, whatever that would be, forages or crops, vegetables, et cetera, as opposed to, the Connecticut River Basin or our hill farms?
Yeah, I mean, I like that question. That's the first question I ask when I come onto a site is, what's the soil texture? What type of soil are we dealing with? Because it's so important for how that soil is going to be managed. We know that with the clays, the more organic matter we can get into them, the better tilth they'll build, the better aggregation we'll have. Those inherently add resilience to those soils. I personally, I think there's some evidence that draining of those soils is helpful for those soils because it allows them to become more aerated and allows them to be managed throughout the entire season rather than just, those few windows in which it's dry enough to get on clay. So yeah, I do think there are some things we can do to improve the way clay is managed, and organic matter is part of that, and just reducing the amount of disturbance in those soils too, trying to maintain aggregation as long as and as much as possible.
Other questions? I was just wondering about so the pictures of the tiling that you showed. I guess the picture of the phosphorus filter. I'm wondering when you're talking about tiling, though, how widespread is that in use now in the state? And is it, do I understand that it's largely here a response to changes in climate?
Yeah, so that, anecdotally, I think that we can say it is a response to climate change. That's what I hear from farmers. In terms of how widespread it is, there's been a lot of tile drainage go in the past 10 years. And I think Heather's done some survey work that actually shows that vegetable farmers may be putting it in at an equal or greater rate than some of our dairy farmers. So it is going in on a lot of farms. It is not a cheap practice. It's, $12 to $1,500 an acre, which is a big investment, but it also has a very short payback period, given the degree that it can improve yield. Payback periods are usually 3 to 5 years, which is pretty good for an investment on a farm. So yes, I would say it's pretty widespread. We don't have it's been really difficult to get data to kind of put a finer point on how much land is being tiled, but anecdotally, I see a lot of tile being.
And just in terms of the benefit then of the practice, is it, when you talk about the yield increase, is that over historic levels, or is that just to bring you back to to mitigate against loss?
It mitigates against loss. It kind of creates, so you can kind of take yourself off a roller coaster with tile and kind of get a nice level road in front of you instead of doing the high points and the low points that come with these weather fluctuations. It's just a more even yield. It also, I think in terms of benefits, it also allows implementation of some of the soil health management practices that we're promoting. It's not just the yield bump. It allows for trafficability and ability to get in the field and do the things we want to do in those shoulder seasons. And that has trickle down effects on for the farm as well, and the environment.
So we've got 2 more questions, I think, Representative Rice and then Representative Lipsky, and then maybe we should move to Heather. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just wondering, what's the lifespan of a tile drainage system? Is it something that is there maintenance? Is there ongoing, and does it have to be replaced after a certain parts of it have to be replaced after a certain period of time? And then also, you started to cover this a little bit, but just could you talk about the relationship between the tile drainage and sort of what that unlocks in terms of other practices that can be implemented?
Yeah, so in terms of lifespan, if tile is properly installed to prevent crushing, it can last, I would not hesitate to say 100 years. There's still tile that's functioning that was installed in the early 1900s. And that's back when it was actually made of true tile, terracotta tile. So as long as it hasn't been crushed or doesn't fill with sediment, and in lots of soils, that's not an issue, filling with sediment, it can last a very long time. In terms of unlocking opportunities for conservation, I think one great example is that in a wet fall, after corn is harvested, so in a wet fall, it'll keep soils drier and more trafficable so that corn might be able to be harvested earlier to allow the planting of a cover crop in a timely manner. So that is a really good example of how tile can help with conservation. Whereas if that field was undrained, then a farmer would not be able to harvest, or they do a lot of soil damage if they did harvest, and they might not be able to want to get back on that field to do the planting of the cover crop. The other thing I think it has a big effect on is whether your field is drained or undrained, the farmer will often apply, thinking about the upcoming season, not knowing how wet it's going to be, they'll apply the same amount of phosphorus to that field. If that field is drained and the crop grows well, that crop will take up that phosphorus. If it was undrained and the crop didn't grow well, it won't take up all that phosphorus. So that phosphorus is then potentially there to be lost to the environment. So those are just a couple of examples.
Representative Lipsky.
I'm trying to visualize this tiling. And if you think in vertical stratum, there's, 3 or 4, if you're lucky, 6 into the topsoil, maybe more. Then you get some subsoil, and then you might have some sandy gravel, and then you might hit this deep base of blue clay or gray clay. Do you have to disturb, how do you get, let's say there's 43,000 square feet in an acre, you're doing a 100-acre project or a 20-acre project. Do you have to where do you want this tile ideally placed in that stratum? And what are the risks to destroying some of that century-old, more organic matter?
Yep, great question. So I guess to start in clay, you want your tile, you want to place it about 3.5 to 4 feet. It's deeper than some other soils because you think about clay, it wicks water. So if you don't get it deep enough, it'll wick, the water will still rise up into the root zone of the crop. So 3.5 to 4 feet is typical and tends to work in clay. In terms of disturbing the soil, it is actually very interesting and impressive to watch the operations that install tile. They actually just use a single shank, like a subsoil type device with a single shank on it. And the tile is on a spool and they basically plow it under. There's a little bit of disturbance, but with going through a winter season of freeze thaw and rain action, and then maybe some light, some tillage in the spring, that disturbance can be addressed, and there's not a lot of flipping that soil profile on its head or anything like that. It's really much better. It used to be going in with a backhoe and digging up trenches all over the field and placing tile, and it's much less disturbance than it used to be.
Thank you.
Josh, thank you very much. I don't see any other hands up. So Heather, would you like to jump in next?
Yes, great, thank you. And I think this leads in nicely to some of the things Joshua was talking about. Let's see here if I can put this on full screen. Okay, so I'm Heather Darby, as was already mentioned. I'm the UVM Extension Agronomist. The last one, actually. Jeff Carter just retired, and Sid Bosworth retired the year before that. So I am the last standing extension agronomist for the state of Vermont at this point. We are in the process of hopefully replacing the agronomist position in Middlebury here, hopefully in the next several months. So that'll be great. I'm also the nutrient management or soil specialist for extension as well. I am located physically in St. Albans, although I cover the entire state, and also pitch in around the entire region with various areas of expertise that I have and can offer farmers outside of Vermont as well. I lead the Northwest Crop and Soil team, which is composed of 17 other extension outreach support staff and specialists, all working in various areas of agriculture to assist farmers throughout the state of Vermont. So our work really ranges from working with dairy farmers to farmers that grow hops and hemp to farmers that are growing grain, soybeans, forages. We do a bit of work with vegetable crops. So we're essentially trying to cover most of what's being done in the state of Vermont for agriculture. I have a website you can visit that is very robust and full of information, all kinds of information, and the website's kind of way up on the top here. But I thought that this highlighted well what our team does, which our goal is to provide the best and most relevant cropping information, both research-based and experiential, delivered in the most practical and understandable ways to Vermont farmers. And again, my goal is to not only conduct very applied research, but to make sure that that information is making its way out to the farming community, and that we're there to help the farming community adapt, adopt, and adjust as needed, as times change, climate changes, markets change, in any way that we can. So I did send to the committee, and Joshua mentioned as well, a recent project that we finished up with farmers throughout the state of Vermont. It was conducted in 2021, and it's a report on the state of soil health in Vermont. And the reason I set out to do this is, multiple fold, I guess. There's a lot of conversation about improving soil health on farms in Vermont for some of the benefits that Joshua mentioned already. We know that healthy soils lead to often healthier environments, water, air quality, oftentimes, resiliency, and hopefully also leads to more resiliency on the farm and optimizing productivity for the farms as well. But what we didn't really know is, how are we doing? What is the state of soil health here in our state? And then what are the opportunities for us to make improvements? It's hard to make improvements and suggest for farmers to try different practices or do something different if we don't really know where we're starting from, right? It's making assumptions around whether or not they're doing a good job with their soil without actually knowing that is a dangerous thing and also not fair. So part of our goal here was to, again, go out with a number of partners that are listed here and try to get a sense of what was happening on soils here in Vermont. Here's some more information. You have the full report. It's a wonderful report. I do really suggest that folks take a look at it. It's beautiful, colorful, and some really meaningful and important data for our state. Just to put things in context a little bit, we know that soil organic matter levels in Vermont are relatively high compared to other places. And these are average organic matter levels collected from, various databases throughout Vermont. So the lab that Joshua manages, the Ag and Environment Testing Lab, with all the samples that have come in there from the state, they have an average organic matter level of 5.3%. Looking at a USDA database, it's about 5.6. You can see there's only 26 points. And you can see with these Cornell soil health tests, a bunch of them, not just the ones in our project, were around 4.8%. So in general, and you can see the USA as a whole, we average all the different data points there is about 3.2%. So overall, Vermont has very high organic matter levels, which is, both part of the landscape that we live in and how the soils were developed here, and the fact that we're also cold. But it also is a testament to the type of farming systems that we have here in Vermont that are really livestock based with lots of grassland, right? Most of our agricultural land in Vermont are grasslands. So we went out and we sampled all types of farms in Vermont, not just livestock operations, but vegetable farms, farmers that grow wheat and grains, so on and so forth. We sampled, it says 150 to 200 fields. It was over 200 fields, but we were able to get various data from different sets of fields. And Joshua mentioned some of those fields were fields he had projects on, some were fields I had projects on, and then just reaching out to all kinds of partners to be able to collect this information. These were all the different indicators of soil health that we measured to the left using the Cornell Soil Health Lab, and also some of the lab testing capabilities we have here at UVM. Again, get a sense of soil health. So I can't go through everything, but I put up a couple of highlights. These are soil health scores. So the maximum score you can get is 100. This is very much like school, right? So 100's really good. 80 is pretty good, actually. Once you start getting below 80, score of 80 on the soil health scale, you know, your health of the soil starts to go down. But what you can see here is that all of the different farming types had these ranges of health, right? So we had vegetable farms that would have excellent soil health and some that had really, really poor soil health. We saw that very similarly with cornfields, right? Really excellent soil health, excellent, rivaling pasture, rivaling hay fields, and then other fields that were very poor. Now, you know, we saw that with pasture as well, and we saw that with hay. Now, with pasture and hay, we tended to see overall higher scores, again, because they're not tilled. That's really the primary reason, and they have constant cover. But you can see there are still fields, many of them, that are poor soil health, and many that are excellent. So really what this indicated to us is so many farms are doing a great job and doing so well, in fact, that there are farms that were hitting 100, approaching 100, very close, which means that we can do it, which means that really likely, hopefully every farm can meet those metrics and that we still have room for improvement, but we know many farms have good soil health and that we can get there. And I think that was what was really exciting to us. And the story sort of plays out the same when we look at the different indicators. So here are, again, farms with vegetables, just field crops, corn, pasture, hay, and you can see the ranges here. And you can see we have cornfields, which this really shocked me, actually, that were almost 7.5% organic matter. And we had hay fields that were 9 and 10%. But on the flip side of that, we had hay fields that were 1% organic matter. 1%. I didn't even know that was possible. Okay. And we had cornfields that were 1%, and we had vegetable fields. So again, just the same take-home message. How do we get all our cornfields to 7.5% organic matter? Really? What's going on with the 1%? And what are they doing? So I think, again, we're doing really well, but there's room for improvement. We also measured carbon stocks. This is of significant interest, and I know somebody actually brought that up. You know, do our agricultural fields hold carbon and store carbon? And this is complicated, as Joshua mentioned. You know, it's not a simple task to measure it. And then the other thing we have to recognize is that agriculture and what we do in our fields and what we grow is constantly evolving. So these are points in time. But what we found out was that, which again was shocking to me, that all of our fields, in some of our fields, we were approaching significantly high levels of carbon storage. I think, and Joshua, correct me if I'm wrong, forest land in Vermont's at 165, 170 metric tons of carbon. So we had fields that were approaching those levels of carbon storage in the top 30 centimeters of the soil. So we were only going down, you know, about a foot. And this again was really exciting that we have cornfields that are storing a lot of carbon, and hay and pasture fields, but we have some that aren't. And really the goal here is to get us all up to those levels. So how do we do that? And really, you know, these are things for those of you on the committee that have heard from me for years, know that I've been working on this with farmers for years. How do we increase soil health, improve soil health so that we can get all the benefits that we get from that, both water, air, and productivity on our farms and resiliency? Well, it's complicated. And it takes a whole number of strategies to be able to do that, which include reducing tillage, right? Adding organic material back to the fields,
right? When we harvest crops, we take away organic material. We have to make sure we're adding organic material back to the fields. And we need to have living, growing crops all the time. So that's really the benefit of grass, right? Is that it sort of does many of these things, which is why we see the soil health often and carbon often much higher in those types of fields.
But we have to make sure that we're adding carbon back to those systems, because when we're harvesting hay or we're grazing those fields, we're removing a lot of carbon, and we have to make sure we're adding it back. Okay, so this is some of the work that I've been doing with farmers over the years, is to increase rotations, right? So we're not just growing corn, to reduce tillage, which we have accomplished and continue to accomplish, and increase adoption on farms in Vermont, and cover cropping, having living cover on those fields all year long. So here's aggregate stability, which is basically the ability of the soil to resist degradation, mostly in our case from rain. So you can see at the bottom in this continuous corn picture, that is poorly aggregated soil, right? When it rains, the soil just sort of bursts apart, and this can cause erosion and runoff of soil. So we don't want this. And we do see that. That's heavy clay, the heavy clay Joshua was talking about in Addison County after 7 inches of rain. So the aggregate stability level there is 32%, which is really poor. Now, as we add practices, better practices to that, you can see the aggregate stability goes up. So if we rotate with hay and corn, then the aggregate stability starts to go up to 60, almost 70. And you can see a picture there of that is Addison County clay, believe it or not, that's really well aggregated after the same rainstorm, 7 inches. And you can see it was in a really good rotation. I had just come out of sod, and you can see how protected that soil was. And then if we start adding in no-till and cover crops with the rotations, whammo, like we have something brilliant, and we have really good soil health. So again, we've been working really hard with farmers. You can see this across the landscape. I know everybody has seen the amount of cover cropping increase. That's very visual. You may not see no-till quite as much, or the rotations even, but we have great adoption, and the adoption continues. And these are just different photos of cover cropping and cover crop management throughout the state on farms. We've done a lot with farmers, not just trying to plant the cover crops, but really trying to manage corn systems as a whole, so that we're growing corn that is good for the cover crops, which is really different. I would have never been able to talk to a farmer about that 10 years ago. But now farmers want to know how to grow better cover crops, which means they have to modify how they grow corn, which is kind of a crazy thing to even think about. We got to grow different varieties. We have to grow different row spacing, population, and maturities. And that's what this graph shows. If we have shorter season corn, we're able to get it off earlier and plant the cover crops. So farmers are highly engaged in our work. This is a project that we just finished up last year, where we had 30 on-farm research sites. That's all those blue dots all over the state working with us to try to figure this out. And that's key to the work that we do. We can't just conduct research in a vacuum. We have to have buy-in. We have to understand what farmers are interested in, willing to do, and integrate them fully into the research, so that we know it's adoptable across the state, and farmers have bought in. So we can see pretty substantial organic matter gains by combining all these practices together. And that's what's really exciting. And in those graphs where you saw the organic matter levels of cornfields up at 7.5%, that's what these farms are doing. They're rotating their corn. regularly, not every 8 years, with perennial forage. And when they are growing corn, it's no-till cover crops, often injected manure, and we're increasing carbon and we're increasing organic matter, soil health, and resiliency of soils across the state. You want to hear more, or are we out of time? Because I can go on.
Well, both. I think we are almost out of time, but we do want to hear more. So maybe.
Let me touch it. I can touch on this pretty quick. I mean, it's complicated,
Okay.
but I just want to give you the gist. We have a low carbon dairy project, separate from what Joshua is doing. This encompasses the whole farm, including, the cows, the fields, the manure management. And it's with 7 farms here in the state of Vermont. You can see it's pretty complicated. We're looking at all facets of the farm. It's really exciting. These are innovative farms. They're already at the cutting edge. And it's really exciting. We're not trying for net zero. We're actually trying to reduce emissions from the farms by about 40 to 50%, which is a humongous undertaking and maybe impossible, actually, frankly. But looking at all aspects of management, from the burps and the farts coming out of cows to emissions coming from fertilizers, and really managing all facets of the system to reduce emissions while actually improving, hopefully, productivity and profitability. So our goal is really on reducing greenhouse gas emissions relative to the pounds of fat and protein corrected milk, which essentially we are really trying to increase fat and protein, so components of the milk, and also to doing that by minimizing purchased feeds, right, and increasing storage of carbon and nitrogen in our soils. So it's complicated, but it's really exciting, and we're making some great headway. And a lot of it has to do with forage management on our farms and really focusing on producing the highest quality forage that we can on our farms so that the cows eat more of it, make higher component milk, and feed less grain, which has many great stories associated with it, both for the farm and the environment. So I think I'll kind of end on that and take some questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions from the committee? Yeah, Representative Templeman.
Heather, hi. So focusing on the development and raising of feed grains,
Yep.
Your work has been focused on mitigating the negative effects specific to carbon and soil quality that raising annual crops have, specifically for what I'm guessing to be feeding livestock. So if we didn't feed grains to livestock, your job would probably be more focused on improving. I mean, if there's a base level and the activity of farmers creates a negative release of carbon. If we didn't have grain feeding, perhaps the focus for you could be on increasing sequestration as opposed to mitigating loss. Am I right or wrong?
Well, I don't want to say you're wrong necessarily, but I think that we are doing all of that. So feed grains, most of our farms do not produce feed grain. So they're not growing corn to harvest as grain. It's harvested as a forage. It's still an annual crop. We do have an increasing level of soybean production in the state to reduce purchased inputs. But most of our focus is actually on increasing the quality and quantity and management of hay so that our farms can feed more of that and feed less grain. Most all the grain for most every farm in the state is imported into the state, which poses other issues. It's somebody else's emissions, right, from somebody else's state or country, but also the nutrients that are brought in. So really our focus is on feeding more grass. Grass is high in energy, which we're trying to evaluate species and harvest timing, harvest methods, storage methods, so that we can feed more high energy grass instead of buying starch to feed the cattle. So it is really what you're talking about is also a big focus of our work on these farms that I was just mentioning and beyond. We do have support from the Dairy Business Innovation Center to do exactly what you were just mentioning. And also a really big USDA project that is focused on grass-only farms, which I could talk to you about for 3 more hours about.
Me too.
Well, I mean, on all aspects, like these real challenges that those farms are facing.
I own one of those farms, and that's why.
Yeah, we just held a grass-fed production course, and we had 120 farms signed up from across the country. We are the only state really focused on research and outreach and extension relevant to grass-only dairy. So we are looked at as a leader there. But there are challenges, as you know, if you own one of those farms.
Representative O'Brien.
Hi, Heather. First we should add that unfortunately Representative Josie Levitt isn't here today, but she represents the islands and she'd be very excited that Allberg got mentioned.
Yeah.
My question is, do you do any research or collaborate with some of your peers on like organic matter in soil sort of close to farming? So like maple sugar bushes, our forest here, lawns, pastures that are no longer farmed or bush hogged or grow up to pasture pine. I just wonder how those compare to some of the more traditional farming techniques.
If you look in the state of soil health, we haven't been sampling those areas, but if you look in the state of soil health report, it does talk about some other land uses and carbon stocks there. We generally think of forest land being really high in carbon, which it is, but some of our ag fields do rival that, which is exciting. I think what all of this has shown me is that the farmers that are adopting a lot of the practices that we've been promoting, they're really meeting these really high metrics, and it's pretty it's really satisfying. I think you've heard me say so many times how depressing it can be when we don't see the lake cleaned up, but we see people doing things and really trying, and a lot of adoption, but we can see it in the soil, which is exciting. So the effort that all of us have put in, you too, right? It's visible, but it never happens fast enough, and we need everybody to be doing it, and that's a challenge.
Well, that's a good thing for us to bear in mind, I think, and thank you for mentioning that. We are pretty much out of time. Time for one more question, I guess. Representative Rice.
It's outside your presentation, but while we have you, I just wanted to quickly ask, is soil testing for PFAS on the lab's radar? And are you through grower extensions, through grower relationships at Extension? Is it something you're hearing about? Hearing concern from growers about it all?
There is interest in it. It is not something we can do in our lab here. It takes pretty specialized equipment because we're talking parts per billion, even parts per trillion for PFAS, and we don't have the sensitivity in our instrumentation. There are some labs at UVM that can do that, but they're research labs. I have heard a handful of people ask that are curious. It's not an overwhelming amount of people. We don't know yet how we're going to meet that need for citizens to test for PFAS. That's where we are now.
Okay, well, thank you both very much for joining us today, and we wouldn't be surprised if we reach out again at some point in the future. This has been a good introduction. We may want to dig a little bit more. So thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.
Take care now. All right, committee, we've got another witness coming in a few minutes, but let's